How is it possible for a $300 billion empire to vanish into thin air? And how did Europe, along with it, lose the first great technological war of our century without even realizing it? The fall of Nokia is not just the story of a company, it is an unsolved case, the mirror of our continent's fragilities and contradictions. Today, we will act as detectives. We will hunt down its three killers to reveal not only the causes of a collapse, but also the power dynamics that still rule the global economy. This is the first investigation of our new series, European Brands, in which we will use the stories of the most iconic brands to understand who we are and where we are heading. If there are other European giants whose secrets you would like to uncover, write it in the comments. Welcome to Amazing Europe. To understand the depth of the fall, we must first measure the dizzying height from which it began. At the end of the 2000s, Nokia was not a company, it was a force of nature. The numbers were so overwhelming they seemed unreal. At its peak, almost 1 out of every 2 phones sold in the world was a Nokia. It was a colossus with a turnover of 51 billion euros, representing alone 4% of the gross domestic product of an entire nation, Finland. An empire whose market capitalization, at its historical peak, approached and even exceeded $300 billion, an enormous figure at the time. But its true power was not in its financial statements. It was in our pockets and in our minds. It was in the Nokia 3310, which had become a global symbol of indestructibility. It was in the Nokia 1100, still the best-selling phone in human history with over 250 million units. Its ringtone, the Nokia tune, was the soundtrack of the planet, heard, according to estimates, nearly 2 billion times a day. Its slogan, "Connecting people," was not marketing, it was reality. Nokia had connected the world. The empire seemed so eternal and untouchable that in October 2007, Forbes dedicated a cover to it that now sounds like a cursed prophecy. Nokia, 1 billion customers. Can anyone catch the king of cell phones? The answer was yes, but no one could imagine that the culprit would not be a rival company. It was a completely new ideology. And they did not know that the giant's killer had already entered the palace, presenting his weapon to the world just 9 months before that cover. January 9th, 2007. Steve Jobs walks onto the stage of the Moscone Center. With his iconic black turtleneck and the charisma of a man who knows he has the future in his pocket, he is not there to present a product. He is there to declare war. With almost surgical precision, he ridicules the entire mobile phone industry, the undisputed kingdom of Nokia. He speaks of phones that are not so smart, filled with physical keyboards, plastic buttons that permanently occupy half of the screen, even when they are not needed. The reaction across the Atlantic, in Nokia's headquarters in Espoo, was a mix of skepticism and arrogance. Nokia's engineers analysed the iPhone, comparing its technical specifications with those of their own products. The verdict, based on that cold analysis, was unanimous. It was not a threat. It lacked 3G, the camera was mediocre, and the battery was a disaster. A top Nokia executive publicly dismissed it as a niche product, and they were not alone. The reaction of Steve Ballmer, then CEO of Microsoft, has gone down in history. He laughed, literally laughed, predicting that the iPhone would have no chance of conquering the market.
What was your first reaction when you saw that?
$500?
But everyone, from Espoo to Redmond, made the same fatal mistake. They judged the weapon of the future with the manuals of the past. They analysed the hardware without realising that the revolution was in the software. They were looking at the object without seeing that Apple was selling an experience. The secret weapon was not the phone, but the multi-touch interface. 1 year later, with the arrival of the App Store, came the coup de grace. The iPhone was no longer a product, it had become an ecosystem, a world. This blindness in the face of a paradigm shift was not a simple miscalculation. It was the first grave symptom of a much deeper disease. A disease that would open the gates of the empire, allowing 3 assassins to strike undisturbed. Nokia's first killer was not a rival, it was Nokia itself. And its disease was, ironically, everything that had once made industrial Europe great. It was the obsession with perfection, the blind faith in hierarchy and bureaucracy, the conviction that stability mattered more than speed. A perfect cocktail to dominate the 20th century, a deadly poison for surviving in the 21st. Inside Nokia's golden fortress, the generals no longer listened to the soldiers on the front lines. Bad news, reports about the rise of the iPhone were softened and filtered until they disappeared. And while the executives lived in an echo chamber of self-celebration, their own departments fought each other like barons competing for a piece of the kingdom, forgetting that a common enemy was marching toward the gates. What united them was a single obsession, the perfection of the object. They believed that the battle would be won with the best hardware, with the most solid physical phone. For them, software was not the soul of the product, but a secondary task, a problem to be solved. And the new ruling class of technology, the app developers, had no intention of creating for an empire that treated them as second-class citizens. And this is the real tragedy. For years, the brain of Nokia's smartphones had been Symbian, its operating system. Once the king of the market, it had become a slow and obsolete maze, despised by developers. Yet Nokia had already created the cure. MeeGo, a modern and brilliant operating system. Its first and only phone, the Nokia N9, was a flash of pure genius, praised by the international press. It was proof that Nokia could save itself. But in 2010, to solve the Symbian crisis, a new CEO arrived, Stephen Elop. His diagnosis was brutal. Symbian was a wreck to be sunk, and MeeGo, in his view, was not ready. Developing it would take too long, and Nokia did not have time. Thus, with a decision many would later call a strategic suicide, Elop chose to abandon everything. He did not just sink the old mutinous ship Symbian, he also decided to burn the new battleship under construction, MeeGo. The door had been opened from within. The first assassin had completed its work, leaving the Empire defenseless against what was coming from across the ocean. If the first assassin was an internal disease, the second was a true clash of economic civilizations. It was not a competition between two phones, but between two worldviews. On one side, European industrial capitalism. On the other, the emerging platform capitalism of Silicon Valley. Nokia was the epitome of the European model. Its philosophy was to build a perfect physical product and sell it. The value was entirely contained in the phone you held in your hand. It was a direct inheritance from Europe's great manufacturing tradition, creating the best goods in the world. Apple, with the App Store, introduced a completely new form of economic power, something alien to Europe. It no longer sold just a product. It created an entire economy. The iPhone was the territory, but the App Store was the marketplace built upon it. Apple did not create all the apps. It created the space where millions of other entrepreneurs, the developers, could open their own shops, and for that privilege, they paid rent, a 30% tax on every transaction. Apple was no longer a manufacturer of goods. It had become the owner of a digital nation, collecting its taxes. This was where the true geopolitical defeat occurred. Europe, with Nokia, knew how to build factories, but America had learned how to build cities. And in this new digital economy, whoever owns the city always wins. While Nokia kept polishing its products, the value had shifted elsewhere. Profits no longer came from selling hardware, but from the countless microtransactions taking place on American platforms. The result was the largest capital and sovereignty flight in modern history. Europe effectively became a digital colony. Its citizens and its companies began to live, work, and spend money inside ecosystems designed, owned, and taxed in California. The second assassin had not merely defeated Nokia, it had redrawn the map of global power, and Europe had just realized it was on the wrong side of the border. And then came the third assassin. It was not an ideology, but a man, a savior who came from afar to extinguish the fire, but instead poured gasoline on it. In 2010, for the first time in its history, Nokia appointed a non-Finnish CEO, the Canadian Stephen Elop, whom we have already mentioned earlier. His origin, however, was a crucial detail. He came directly from the upper ranks of Microsoft. His first move was not that of a doctor, but of a gravedigger. With an internal memo that went around the world, the famous Burning Platform memo, he publicly declared that Nokia was a desperate company, a ship on fire. It was an act of self-sabotage without precedent, which caused the brand's value and employee morale to collapse. But that was only the beginning. His diagnosis was brutal. In his view, since MeeGo, the homemade cure, was too slow to arrive in time, Nokia urgently needed a new operating system. The crossroads was clear and would decide the future of technological Europe. On one side, there was the most logical path, adopting Android, joining the ecosystem that was already winning the war. On the other, a reckless gamble, tying the company's fate to Windows Phone, a newborn operating system with no real army of apps or developers. Elop's choice defied every industrial logic. He rejected Android. His official justification? He feared becoming a mere vassal of Google. And his solution? To become the exclusive vassal of another American giant, Microsoft, which, coincidentally, was his former company. It was an unconditional surrender that handed over Nokia's technological sovereignty in exchange for a promise of salvation. A salvation that never came. Under his leadership, Nokia's sales collapsed, falling from nearly 1 in 4 phones sold worldwide to barely 3 in 100. And here, tragedy turns into a thriller, because the sequence of events stops looking like a mistake and begins to resemble a plan. Many analysts have described it as a real Trojan horse. What many believe is that Elop, a loyal Microsoft man, was never sent to Nokia to save it, but to sink it and deliver it to the enemy. And then came the proof that turned suspicion into accusation, the reward. In 2013, Elop orchestrated the sale of Nokia's entire mobile division to Microsoft, for a price everyone considered a giveaway. For presiding over this disaster, he received a personal bonus of nearly 19 million euros. The third assassin had not only destroyed a company, he had shown the entire world what happens when a European champion, in its moment of need, opens its doors to an American partner without realizing that he might be a conqueror disguised as an ally. The shockwave of that technological assassination did not stop at the company gates. It struck Finland with the force of an economic earthquake. Tens of thousands of jobs vanished. An entire generation of talented engineers was left adrift, and 4% of the nation's gross domestic product was wiped out. And just when it seemed that the worst was over, the coup de grace arrived. Because the digital revolution, once it had destroyed Finland's technological champion, also took down the second pillar of its economy. The irrefutable proof of this double blow was delivered by Finland's former Prime Minister, now President of the Republic, Alexander Stubb, with a sentence that sounds like a verdict. You could say that the iPhone killed Nokia and the iPad killed our paper industry. What does that mean? It means that the same hand, Apple's hand, delivered 2 deadly strikes. The first, the iPhone, destroyed Nokia, the high-tech giant. The second, the iPad, exponentially accelerated the transition from printed books and newspapers to digital content. And what was Finland's other great export besides phones? Paper, produced from its immense forests. It was an economic execution on 2 fronts, orchestrated unintentionally by a single Californian company. Finland was no longer fighting a competitor. It was fighting an epochal change that was making its 2 greatest assets obsolete at the same time. This was no longer an industrial crisis. It was a national identity crisis. For nearly a decade, Finland sank into a deep recession, a lost decade from which it struggled to emerge. But why did this country suffer so much more than others? Why, once it fell, did it find it so hard to rise again? The answer comes from Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, and it is the euro. To be clear, Krugman's thought is not anti-European, but simply pragmatic. As he explained, in the past, Finland would have had a secret weapon to escape the crisis, devaluing its own currency, making its products cheaper, more competitive, and reigniting its economy. But by surrendering its monetary sovereignty to Frankfurt, Finland found itself trapped in a strong currency that was lethal for a nation in crisis. But what happened to Nokia today? You absolutely need to know this because it reveals what Europe truly is, and what we Europeans could become if we wanted to. But before finding out if you found this video informative, we ask you to support our project by giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, and clicking the bell so you don't miss our new videos. And we also remind you of our new channel, America vs. Europe, where we rank all European countries, the United States and Canada according to different factors. While the world was celebrating Nokia's funeral, in the offices of Espoo, a new CEO, Rajeev Suri, was planning not a resurrection, but a reinvention. His move was brilliant, a strategic retreat so clever it turned into a victory. The plan was simple. The war for consumers' hearts was lost. Europe had lost. There was no point in wasting more lives. Suri took the billions earned from Microsoft and turned them into a war chest to conquer a new battlefield. The invisible foundations of the digital world. Nokia would no longer sell objects to people, but the highways on which those objects would travel. And in 2015, Nokia made its checkmate move by acquiring its rival Alcatel-Lucent. But it didn't just buy a company, it bought a legend, Bell Labs, the place where the technological world as we know it was invented. It wasn't a simple acquisition, it was a masterstroke. The fallen European champion had just laid hands on the DNA of American innovation. And here, the story finds its most sublime irony. Today, Nokia is a healthy giant worth about $40 billion, one of the world leaders in building 5G networks. And your smartphones, the same iPhones and Samsungs that killed Nokia's phones, are useless without 5G networks. To function, the killers desperately need their victim. But that's not all. Thanks to its patents, Nokia earns a royalty on nearly every smartphone sold on the planet. The fallen king collects a silent tax from his successor. And finally, the ultimate geopolitical paradox. In the new technological Cold War between America and China, the Chinese giant Huawei has been banned from several Western countries. And who remains to build our critical infrastructures? Mainly two European companies. One is Ericsson, the other is Nokia. From a fallen national champion to an invisible pillar of our digital security. Nokia lost the battle for our pockets, but it won the silent war to connect the world. The story of Nokia is not just the story of a brand, but a mirror reflecting the double soul of our Europe, and perhaps also its double future. The first soul is the one that lost. It is the mirror of an Europe in love with its industrial past, convinced that engineering perfection would be enough. A hierarchical, slow, bureaucratic, and at times arrogant Europe that looked at the American digital revolution not with the hunger of a conqueror, but with the skepticism of an old empire too sure of itself. The fall of Nokia is a warning carved in stone, but the fall of that empire also reveals another Europe. The Europe that, once stripped of its crown, rediscovers its true power. It is the Europe that knows how to rebuild its own foundations from its ashes. Nokia's rebirth is our positive lesson. It teaches us that the ingenuity of us Europeans has not disappeared. It shows us that when we stop chasing other people's models, when we stop depending on and selling ourselves completely to others, and instead focus on what we do best, we can still be indispensable. Nokia, for example, managed to build the complex and essential technology that cannot be seen but supports the world. If it wants to, the whole of Europe can do the same. It has the potential, but only if it decides to abandon its first soul. The one, as we said before, of being a hierarchical, slow, bureaucratic, and at times arrogant Europe. Europe's destiny can go two ways: to cling to the dynamics of the past or to reinvent itself with courage. And we, what do we choose? To better understand the economic and geopolitical dynamics of our continent, we strongly recommend watching this video where we analyse 5 European Union countries that were at serious risk of bankruptcy, exploring the real causes and identifying the true culprits. That's all for this video. See you next time!